Stay with me until the end of this story, because what Ruth found beneath the floorboards of that forgotten guest house did not just change everything she thought she knew about her inheritance. It changed everything she thought she knew about her father. The attorney's office smelled of radiator heat and old carpet. Ruth sat in a chair that pressed too firmly against her spine, her hands folded over the canvas bag in her lap, wearing the gray cardigan she had owned since 2013. To her left, her brother Martin, 57, wore a suit that cost more than Ruth earned in a month. To his left, Diane, 54, had a leather notebook open before the attorney had finished arranging his papers. The attorney read, "Martin received the family home, £380,000. Diane received the investment accounts and the full contents of the estate, £214,000. Ruth received the guest house, a secondary structure located at the rear of the original property. Last inhabited in 1984, currently without utilities. In a state of significant disrepair." Martin did not laugh. He looked at his phone. Ruth sat completely still and said nothing. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. She kept her hands exactly where they were. Ruth Calloway had been the one who stayed. When Edmund Calloway left in the autumn of 1983, Ruth was 23 years old. He did not die, though that was the version Martin and Diane were eventually given, softened, sealed, and never reopened. He simply left, and the circumstances were never discussed, and Ruth was already too busy holding everything together to demand that they be. Their mother, Eleanor, retreated somewhere interior, and stayed there for the better part of 2 decades. Ruth managed the retreat. She deferred her place at a design college in Bristol, a letter she had carried in her coat pocket for 6 days before making the call, and took a position as a bookkeeper at a firm 4 miles from the family home. She was still working there 31 years later when they made her redundant at 54. She organized Martin's university applications the autumn. Eleanor couldn't concentrate on anything longer than a paragraph. She planned Diane's wedding in the 3 weeks before the ceremony when Diane's nerve failed completely and someone had to speak to the caterers. Martin built a career in Leeds. Diane built a life in Edinburgh. Ruth built nothing for herself. She built everything for them, so quietly and so completely that by the time it was finished, neither of them remembered there had been anything difficult to do. She handed Martin's solicitor the key to her mother's house on a Thursday afternoon without being asked twice. "Before we go further, tell us where you're tuning in from, because this story belongs to every person who has ever been the one who stayed." Martin called on the Thursday, not to ask how she was. He had spoken, he said, to a developer with existing interest in the original property's rear plot. The timing was favorable. The market in that area was moving. It would be practical, he said, to make a decision before the interest cooled. He used the word practical 4 times in 6 minutes. He spoke in the measured, reasonable tone of a man who had long ago stopped distinguishing between what benefited everyone and what benefited him. Ruth listened. She said she would think about it. Martin said not to think too long. Diane called the following morning. Her opening was softer. She asked how Ruth was holding up, mentioned how hard the whole process had been on everyone, said she had been thinking about Mum. Then she arrived, unhurriedly, at the point. The guest house had always been a complication for the estate. The developer's offer was apparently quite fair. Ruth should take it, find somewhere lovely for herself, somewhere manageable. Diane said the word lovely twice. She meant smaller. She meant somewhere that required nothing further from either of them. Ruth thanked her and ended the call and set the phone down on the kitchen counter of the rented room she was currently living in, the only room she could afford on a bookkeeper's pension. But neither Martin nor Diane had ever once walked through the door of that guest house. And neither of them had any idea what 40 years of silence had been keeping inside it. The drive to the guest house. She drove to the guest house on a Tuesday morning in November with no particular plan beyond seeing it. The side gate that accessed the rear of the original property had rusted into a permanent lean, its bottom corner dragging a shallow arc through the wet ground when she pushed it. The path beyond was stone-flagged, the flags themselves almost entirely consumed by moss. dark green and soft underfoot in the way that things get soft when nothing has disturbed them for a very long time. The smell was wet leaves and cold earth and something underneath both. The particular stillness of a place that has been left to its own quiet devices across decades. Ruth walked slowly. Her footsteps made almost no sound. The guest house emerged from the back of the property the way things emerge from November mornings on the Yorkshire edge. Without drama, without announcement, simply becoming visible as the gray light found it. Stone walls. A low roofline. One window on the ground floor, its glass intact, filmed with the residue of 40 undisturbed winters. The door was wooden, swollen deep into its frame. She put her shoulder against it. It opened. If this story is already finding you somewhere real, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I have something waiting for you that you will not want to miss. Ruth stood in the doorway. The light inside was thin and gray. The smell was cold stone and time that had not been touched. She stepped in. What was under the floorboards? The walls were solid stone. The roof had held. Ruth moved through the interior the way she had always moved through difficult things. Methodically, without rushing, registering what was actually there rather than what she had expected to find. She was not looking for anything. She was simply assessing. The floorboard found her. Third step from the far wall, her weight shifted left, and the board lifted at one end with a hollow sound that was different from the boards around it. Not rot, not settling. Something underneath creating a cavity where there should have been none. She knelt. Her fingers found the edge of the board and lifted it. Beneath it lay a package wrapped in oilcloth, tied with waxed cord, completely dry. She set it on the floor beside her and untied the cord carefully, the way she did most things, without hurrying, without tearing. Inside the oilcloth was a tin box. Inside the tin box were 3 items. A letter dated March 1984, written in a hand she had not seen in 40 years. A legal document from a solicitor's firm in Halifax, establishing a property trust in Ruth Eleanor Calloway's name specifically, covering the guest house and the 1.4 acres of land on which it stood, signed by Edmund Calloway and formally witnessed. And a second letter, unsealed, shorter, written in the same hand. It began, "Ruth, I knew you would be the one to come." She read it once. Then she sat down on the cold stone floor, the tin box opened beside her, the November light coming through the single window, and she held the letter in both hands and did not move. What Ruth said to Martin called at 2:30. He had spoken to the developer again. The offer was time-sensitive. He needed Ruth's answer before the end of the week, and his tone carried the specific quality of a man who has already mentally allocated the proceeds and is waiting only for the paperwork to confirm what he considers settled. Ruth let him finish. Then she told him, in the same steady voice she had used across 40 years of difficult conversations that nobody else had wanted to have, that the guest house was not part of their mother's estate. It had been placed in trust for her by their father in March 1984. Before the story about Edmund Calloway was constructed and agreed upon and sealed, before Martin and Diane were told he had died, she told him the documentation was legal and formally witnessed. She told him the solicitor's firm in Halifax was still operating. She told him she had already made an appointment for Friday morning. Martin went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when the ground beneath a long-held assumption simply disappears. Diane called an hour later. Her opening was warm. Ruth let her finish also. Then she said the same things in the same order, in the same tone. When Diane began to speak about family, Ruth told her, without sharpness and without hesitation, that their father had said everything that needed saying in 1984, that she intended to honor what he had built. She ended the call. She set the phone face down on the windowsill and looked out at the land her father had given her, the light already fading at 4 in the afternoon, the way November light does in Yorkshire. What the guest house became by April, the trust had been formally confirmed. Martin had consulted an attorney in Leeds and been advised, briefly and apparently without ambiguity, that there was no viable case. He did not call again. Diane sent a short message in February that Ruth read once and did not answer. The guest house took 6 weeks to make livable. Ruth oversaw every decision herself, hiring locally, choosing what the structure actually needed over what was fastest or least expensive. A plumber from the village. an electrician recommended by the post office, a retired stonemason named Allen who lived at the end of the lane and appeared one Saturday morning with his tools and spent 2 full weekends repointing the exterior walls without discussing payment. When Ruth raised it, he said, only that the building deserved to be looked after properly. He came back the following Saturday and finished the pointing on the north face without being asked. Ruth moved in during the 3rd week of March. She planted the kitchen garden along the south-facing wall in early April. Herbs first, then vegetables, the same sequence her father had followed in the garden behind the family home, a detail she had found recorded in his handwriting inside the trust documents, small and precise in the margin of a page, about something else entirely. She had also found a photograph, Edmund Calloway standing in that garden in the summer of 1981. His sleeves rolled to the elbow, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite smiling, but was something close to it. The photograph sat on the windowsill beside the tin box. Ruth knelt in the April soil at dusk, her hands working steadily along the herb bed, the light going gold and soft across the 1.4 acres her father had set aside for her before everything fell apart. She was not thinking about Martin. She was not thinking about Diane. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, leave one word in the comments that describes what you discovered on the other side of your hardest beginning. Because Edmund Calloway knew his daughter would come. He built something to be there when she did.